All right, welcome. We're going to have a short discussion about education and how to build and use rubrics. Now, the first rubric we're going to look at is a fairly standardized rubric that is used often. It is the basic look and feel for what you expect rubrics to look and feel like, but it is definitely not my favorite. And anytime I've given the option to not use this type, I definitely use it. Basically, this is a rubric where the students can accrue a few points here and there. And we are not only grading on whether or not they did a particular part of the project, but also how well did they do the project. And that's a different train of thinking, and it has its place. Keep in mind that it definitely has its place. So if we're wanting to show growth over time, over a long period of time, so how is somebody fitting in on a scale? Not just did they do this activity, but how well did they do this particular activity? And did they do it better now than they did it 6 months ago or 6 years ago? Then this first type of rubric can be fairly useful. Okay, it's got a sliding scale on it, so to speak. There's another one too that we want to look at, and it's what I call an all or nothing rubric, and I'm going to look at that one, and that's one of my own design. Another big question to think about when you do rubrics is this for a grade? And if it's for a grade, what's the grade translation from the rubric? Because maybe you have a 0 to 4 scale on the rubric. How do you translate that score into a grade? Is it they got there a total of there are 4 sections. Each section is worth a total of 14 points, so there's 16 points total on the entire rubric. But we really don't expect anyone to get more than 8 points, so we'd make it 8 points a B. How do you translate that over? How does that fit? That creates a lot of, you have to really kind of build that, and that creates its own set of problems to use. And it has its uses, but it creates its own sets of problems to use. So when we start building the rubric has to be directly tied to the purpose behind the rubric. And then you also need to know on the front end, is it going to be for a grade or not for a grade? I've built rubrics that were on a sliding scale that were not designed to be attached to a grade of any type. They're just simply to assess understanding of student learning or where the student is in their learning process. And that in itself is an acceptable way of doing things as well. And that's kind of the idea behind this first one here, although this first one is actually used for a grade. So we'll just jump right into that first one there. So this is on a sliding scale. We have the criteria: the ineffective, needs improvement, effective, and highly effective. So this is a project that we do here with our education students. And I'm using this for those of you who are watching this video who are in my education classes. You have this to go by to look at. But the idea is that we want people to be effective, or ideally highly effective. But the first time you do, the first time you're aligning, let's look at part one, align to standards. The very first time you do that, it probably is going to need improvement. At best case scenario, it's almost definitely there might be some alignment, but the big details rather, are going to kind of miss the boat a little bit. And they're going to need to be refined and processed, and that's fine, because if you are a college student going into education, you're not an expert at education yet. The whole reason you're going through this process is to become an expert, and that is fine. There shouldn't be any issue with realizing that you're at the beginning of the journey and you need to improve on something. And that's where this comes into use. Translating this into a grade is something very different, right? So when we start talking about what it means to have 2s on everything for this class that this particular rubric is attached to, might have a very different meaning than what it would be for a senior who has already done their student teaching. Those would be 2 different scores, or what would be acceptable would be a very different score. So maybe right now, 2s across the board is what's acceptable. And then when you are finishing your student teaching, a 3 is what is acceptable. So the criteria of what's acceptable can change, but the rubric itself doesn't. So that's one of the strengths in the sliding scale version of this. If you're using a rubric in a classroom, though, where you're having the sliding scale, what is passing, what's failing for that rubric. Because in that instance, are you going to have them fix the project? Are you going to have them redo the project later? If you're looking for a growth model of some sort, this particular rubric works quite well. But if you're assigning a grade, this isn't necessarily the best choice of that. So we're going to look at another way to do rubrics. And keep in mind that these are two examples of how to build rubrics. These are not the only two ways to build rubrics. These are just two of them. So what you're looking at here with this one, where you can get some of the points, but not necessarily all the points, this is a rubric to show growth over time. It is not a single instance here. This particular rubric will be used again and again for the same cohort of students, right? For a particular project where there is no repetition, there's no growth, there's just, did they get it or did they not get it? So I do a project in my calculus class where the students find the volume of a donut. For fun, I call it a tubular dough ring, which is what TDER stands for. And they go through and they earn the points. Those points are all or nothing. So let's just look at the top left square. It says equation created 10 points. If they didn't create the equation properly, completely, they don't get any points. It's 0 points, because everything after that is going to be flawed based upon the fact the equation was not created or was not created properly. So there have been instances where students have said have trouble creating the equation, so I help them create the equation, and they don't get those 10 points because they're not the ones that did it. I did. So if I created the equation and then they were able to do the rest of the project from that, well, then they can still earn 100 points, but they don't get the 10 points for the work I did. They need to get their 100 points for the work they did. So this creates another dynamic with the students where you can go through. And keep in mind also is that with the equation created, I can do a whole other example that is mimicking what I need them to do, and then they can go back through and create the equation on their own and still earn those 10 points. Right? And then there's a lot more than 100 points in this rubric, and in fact some of these boxes can actually be done multiple times. So they can earn a lot more than 100 points in this rubric. So they only have to get to 100. But the other aspect of this is that this would be being done over an entire unit, and they'd be working on individual pieces at a time. And the goal here is I want them to be able to do this particular thing without defect. So thinking forward, if this was an engineer, this student is an engineer in 10 years, or this student is a doctor in 10 years, or this student is whatever, how accurate does that individual need to be in their particular career choice? Do we want the doctor that is sometimes good at doing bypass surgeries? Do we want the engineer that is sometimes good at designing bridges? Do we want the computer programmer that is occasionally good at programming a car's computer so it doesn't crash? And like Tesla only crashes half the time. That's pretty good, right? And I think the statistic is actually a lot higher than that. I think it's like a 99% success rate, or 1% of the time there crashes, which people harp on, but that's actually a significantly lower number than humans do, because that's a repetitive process there, and the computer can do that quite easily. The idea is, going forward in this, is that these are skills that I want the students to be flawless at least once. I want them to be able to do it once perfectly. And I don't think that's an unrealistic expectation, especially when they're not doing this in a testing situation. They have several days to work on this project, anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to work on a particular project. So if that's the case, then how can you say that they don't have the time or the ability to create one equation on their own perfectly? That should be a skill that a student can have and develop inside of a project. So that's the two different perspectives on developing rubrics, or two perspectives on developing rubrics. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, and I attempted not even to call it a deep dive on it especially. But the idea is, when I design a rubric for a project or for a test or whatever it be, I'm designing it with the idea that in my math classroom, it is done perfectly. A particular aspect is done perfectly. Let's say you're doing something for an English course and you're designing the project. A thing in the project could be everything was spelled correctly. Grammar is perfect. You say, well, that's really harsh. Well, that could be two different squares worth 5 points or 10 points each. And if there's one thing spelled wrong, then they don't get all those points. And if you want reasons why we want that type of criteria, go read a Yahoo article and start picking apart all the grammar and misspellings in a Yahoo article on the internet by a journalist. And I'm always amazed. I'm not a great reader, but when I read through journalism articles, I find mistakes, grammar mistakes, spelling mistakes, in words that are used wrong, punctuation issues. We want them to have those skill sets. And there's nothing saying that they can't get it perfect for one paper, right? So grammar, spelling, content can be a whole nother thing. The main idea. So you can start to develop this project with lots of different ideas. Can they offer a different perspective on it? Is there an art piece that can go along with the written piece? Is there some type of data production they can have? What does their citation look like? All the different ways you can assign all or nothing points for those individual pieces that still position the student to get a good grade while also assessing what they do actually and do not know. All right. So think about these in terms of rubrics and what we can and can't do with rubrics and why we want different rubrics for different purposes. And as you build rubrics, each one has a purpose, and think very distinctly about why you want to do that particular rubric for that particular project. Also, if you have questions or comments or you want help developing a rubric, please reach out. I'm more than happy to meet on an individual basis to help you develop a rubric. I think that the second one here, the all or nothing point blocks, is something a lot of people don't think about, and I'm very happy to help you build either type of rubric that you wish, and to assess your students in the way that you feel you need to. All right, take care.